In my last video, I listed what, in my opinion, were the top 10 most violent anime made before the year 2000. So in this video, I'm going to follow that up by listing my top 10 most violent anime made from the year 2000 onward. In general, ultra-violent anime have become a little bit less common in modern times than they were in the past, in large part due to the industry moving away from the OVA format to a TV format where the creators had to adhere to more strict TV censorship guidelines. But that's not to say that there are no anime from more recent times that are just as violent as anime from the past. So this is my list of the most violent anime from year 2000 onward. So first, at number 10, I have the Berserk Golden Age movies. This is a trilogy of movies based off of Kentaro Miura's legendary manga. These films adapt the Golden Age arc of the manga, which gives Guts backstory and showing him first meeting up with Griffith and joining the Band of the Hawk, and then going through the events that would lead to Griffith's betrayal. Personally, I would prefer just to read the manga, but these films do a pretty good job of adapting it. When these first came out, I didn't like them all that much because I thought the CGI looked pretty bad in a few of the scenes, but compared to the 2016 anime, these films actually look pretty great. The 2016 anime is also pretty violent and could have made it onto this list, but I gave the edge to the film trilogy because the violence looked a little bit more realistic than it did in the 2016. In terms of violence and gore, these films have a ton of scenes that make it qualify for this list. There's many scenes of extremely violent battles, people getting cut apart, cut in half, having their limbs cut off. Each film is completely filled with violent battles that will definitely satisfy anyone who's looking for that type of action. All this culminates in the third film probably being the most violent of the three, ending with a scene of the eclipse, which shows a large number of people being killed and torn apart and eaten by monsters. Plus, if you don't know what's coming, an extremely shocking graphic scene that would traumatize even the most hardened anime fan. And at number 9, I have Pupa. This is a 2014 anime series based on a manga by the same title. It ran for a single 12-episode season, with each episode lasting only about 4 minutes each. The story is about a brother and sister, and one day the sister is infected with a virus that causes her to transform into a monster that eats humans. I think the brother is partially infected by the virus, and he doesn't transform into monsters, but he gains the monster's regenerative abilities, which allows him to heal from any amount of damage that he takes. So basically, in order to protect his sister, he allows his sister to eat his body because she has an uncontrollable hunger for human flesh, and then she'll eat him and then he'll regenerate and just repeat the cycle. The unfortunate thing about this anime is that it's known as a notoriously bad anime. Personally, I have not read the manga that this is based off of, so I don't know if it's better there. I assume it must be, because I think the series really suffers from having only 4-minute episodes, as there's very little plot and explanation of things, and things just sort of seem to just happen. Despite being a pretty bad anime and failing to fit much story into the short episodes, the creators instead packed each episode with a ton of violence and gore. The series is extremely gory, especially with the scenes of the sister eating the brother's body. It's really disturbing watching her bite into his flesh and eat him while he's still alive. There's also a number of other violent scenes where she transforms into a monster and kills people and tears them apart, as well as a scene where they're captured by scientists and hacked up and tortured by the scientists as they experiment on his body. These scenes take up a very large percentage of the runtime of this anime. You can watch this anime in its entirety in under an hour, and I would say probably at least 45 minutes or more are scenes of violence and gore. So despite being known as one of the worst anime of all time by a lot of people, it still does manage to make it into the list as one of the most violent and gory anime of all time. And number 8, I have Higurashi. This is a series based off of a visual novel by the same title, and is a series that I actually haven't had too much personal experience with, but I've heard it be praised by many fans for years as one of the greatest horror anime or horror visual novels of all time. The visual novel especially I've heard be praised as one of the peaks of mystery and storytelling within the medium. I promise I'll get to reading the visual novel eventually, and I've always been kind of put off by the length of the anime series and the huge number of sequels that it has, so forgive me on this intro if I don't know everything about the series, but I did watch a bit, and I do know that this is one of the most violent anime that I've seen, and definitely is worthy of making the list for the top 10 most violent anime to come out since year 2000. The series is about a group of friends that live in a small rural village called Hinamizawa. and this village has an annual festival dedicated to its local deity called Oyashiro. For the last several years, horrible murders have been taking place on the date of the festival. The group tries to investigate the murders as well as survive themselves. This anime is completely filled with scenes of very violent, very brutal murders, as well as some really gruesome, very brutal scenes of torture that really, in my opinion, are what puts it ahead of other violent anime, because these scenes of torture that it shows are extremely brutal and graphic and really make the violence that were depicted be really shocking and really stand out to me among a lot of other violent anime. At number 7, I have Elfen Lied, a TV anime that began in 2004. In Elfen Lied, there's a type of beings called Diclonius that look like humans but have a type of telekinetic power that uses invisible arms called vectors that they're able to use as weapons. This series focuses on one of these beings, a girl named Lucy, who's captured and is studied in an underground facility. She ends up escaping and suffers damage to her mind that causes her to revert to a childlike state. As she's in the state after escaping from the facility, she's found by 2 local children that live in the area, and she's taken in by them. They end up getting involved in and being subjected to attempts by a government special force team that tries to capture these Diclonius and are after them and are trying to recapture Lucy. Like all the anime on this list, this anime is filled with scenes of violence. Probably the most notable scene is right in the first episode where Lucy escapes from the facility. In this one, she kills a very large number of people, using her powers to tear apart everyone within the facility and all the guards trying to keep her from escaping. This is among one of the bloodiest scenes from any anime that I know about, and has a pretty high body count as well. The anime doesn't really put too much detail into the gore, which makes it rank a little bit lower for me, but there is a ton of blood where people are getting torn apart, resulting in huge sprays of blood, and throughout there's a lot of brutal violence, whether it's from clashes with the soldiers trying to recapture Lucy or other people that she comes in contact with. Probably the most brutal scene in my opinion actually was a scene where some kids kill her pet puppy by repeatedly beating it, causing her to lose it and kill the children as well. Personally, to me, the scenes of the animal abuse was probably the most disturbing of the entire series. I think this anime really tries to depict the levels of cruelty that people can have towards each other, and chooses to show this through scenes of incredible violence anytime it gets a chance to. At number 6, I have Blood Sea. This is a 12-episode series that aired in 2011. This series is a part of the same franchise as Blood the Last Vampire and Blood Plus, but it's not a sequel of any of those. It just kind of takes the same ideas, just with some thematic similarities. The story is about a high school girl named Saya Kisaragi, who is a shrine maiden at a shrine in a small village. She was trained by her father to fight with a sword in order to fight against vampiric monsters that feed on human blood. This is definitely one of the most bloody anime that I've ever seen. Basically every episode is completely filled with very over-the-top violence, mostly centering around these monsters feeding upon humans. These result in some of the most over-the-top bloody deaths I've ever seen. Actually, before I even knew what anime this was from, I'd always see these clips from this anime posted online. These deaths range from being so over the top and ridiculous that they're basically funny to some that are actually pretty gruesome and disturbing. Probably the funny one that stands out to me is a scene where these monsters that look like giant bunny rabbits, and this one has like this sack that he's scooping people into, and he has a sack full of people, and another one of the rabbits transforms his arm into like a drill and grinds him up, and blood's all flying everywhere. And probably the most graphic, brutal death that was the most disturbing to me was a scene where they grab onto this one girl and tear her apart limb from limb with blood spraying all over the place. That one stood out to me as being probably the most violent and brutal moment in an anime that's full of scenes like that. At number 5, I have Shigarui Death Frenzy. This is a 2007 anime based off of a manga that was even more violent. This anime opens up with 2 swordsmen preparing to have a final duel with each other. Both have horrible scars from previous conflicts. One of the men is blinded and the other is missing an arm. Before the duel occurs, the story cuts back to the past and shows the backstory of these 2 men and how things happened for them to come to this point. They were both rival students under an extremely powerful swords master, and they were competing for the right to marry the master's daughter and inherit the school for themselves once the master dies. This is a series that really focuses on the brutality of sword fighting and tries to depict it in a way that's a little bit more realistic than is shown in very many other series. All of the fights and duels are extremely high stakes, and they put a lot of focus on showing the consequences of these fights. being very detailed with all the damage that they take. Anytime anyone gets hit with a sword, they put a lot of detail in showing their flesh tearing and depicting a very large amount of blood and a lot of gore. Something that the members of the sword fighting dojo do is that anytime they're disrespected or someone challenges them, they make a point in their fight with them to mutilate them as much as possible so that they're left with horrible injuries that will never fully heal. So anytime anyone sees them, everyone knows what happens to people that mess with their group. This results in a lot of scenes with extremely bloody and really brutal violence. The anime does a good job of adapting the amount of the manga that it covers, but I would probably recommend reading the manga if possible over watching the anime, just because the anime drops off on a cliffhanger and never resolves the story, and there was never a second season, so you would have to read the manga if you want to see how things end. And the manga is even more violent and over the top with even more gore than was in the anime. On to number 4, I have Amon, the Apocalypse of Devilman. This is an anime that just barely made it onto this list and was just barely left off the list from my previous video, as this OVA single episode came out in the year 2000. This OVA is somewhat of a sequel to those 80s Devilman OVAs, and this one is even more violent than those ones. The type of violence seen in this OVA is kind of similar to the violence in those OVAs, but they made it even more graphic and more brutal, taking this OVA in an even darker direction. The OVA is based off of a manga written by Go Nagai that is kind of a retelling or alternate reality from the original Devilman manga. The premise of the story starts out the same, with Akira Fudo fusing with a powerful devil named Amon, gaining devil powers and becoming the Devilman in order to protect humanity from the devils that are trying to wipe them out. The point where the story takes a major deviation from the original story and goes into a darker direction is where Amon is able to break free of Akira's control and becomes free to run wild and slaughter everyone in his path, humans and devils alike. This OVA takes on a darker tone, looking at the dark sides of humanity, depicting the paranoia and violence coming from people never knowing what people are going to be taken over by a devil, or maybe a devil in disguise, resulting in humans forming mobs that go around and commit horrible acts towards each other that are arguably even more violent and horrible than the acts that the devils commit upon them. Early in this OVA, Akira's close friend and love interest, Miki, and her brother are murdered by a mob, which ends up being the catalyst for Akira's mind losing its stability and allowing Amon to regain control. The action and fights in this OVA are incredible and are also extremely violent and extremely bloody, being even more violent than the OVAs from the 80s, and then also having the aspect of showing the violence that humans commit upon each other, which is also something that leads us to be more violent than the original OVA series and ends up being one of the most violent anime that I've ever seen. At number 3, I have Hellsing Ultimate. This one is an OVA series that began releasing in 2006 based on Koto Hirano's Hellsing manga. There was also a Hellsing TV series from 2001, which was actually one of the first anime that I ever saw. But then the series was remade as an OVA with a more manga-accurate storyline. And being an OVA instead of a TV series, they were able to crank up the violence to a level that was way higher than what was shown in the original anime. The plot centers around the Hellsing Organization, which is an organization that aims to protect humanity from vampires or other supernatural beings that would put them in danger. This organization also employs a very powerful vampire named Alucard that gives the Hellsing organization a clear advantage over anyone they face. The Hellsing organization faces its biggest threat when a man who calls himself the Major, who previously during World War II worked on a project creating Nazi vampires in order to try to help Germany win World War II, suddenly reemerges, using the results of that research to create a new vampire army that will engage in endless war and destruction. This is an extremely bloody anime filled with scenes of vampires tearing people apart and eating them alive. There's also a ton of great action sequences with very bloody fights between Alucard and other vampires, where usually eventually Alucard will absolutely destroy them in extremely violent fashion. The most violent scenes to me were probably the scenes where the Major's army invades Britain and the army slaughters civilians and eats many of them alive. But really there's pretty much non-stop violence throughout this whole OVA series, with people getting torn or sliced apart and vampires getting shot by Alucard. If you're looking for an anime that's extremely action focused with a ton of crazy fights and a lot of bloody violence, this is a great anime for you. And at number 2, I have Corpse Party Tortured Souls. This is a 4-episode OVA released in 2013. It is based on a series of video games, the first being created in 1996 for the PC-98 and has gotten several remakes and sequels. The story is about a group of high school students who perform a ritual one night at their school that they believe is meant to help them be friends forever. Instead, this ritual causes them to be pulled into an alternate dimension that contains an elementary school that existed on the same grounds that their high school does. A series of horrible murders of children was committed at this elementary school, resulting in the school closing and being torn down, and then the new high school was built on top of it. The school contains the vengeful spirits of the murdered children as well as the murderer, and these spirits start killing off this group of friends in extremely brutal ways, one by one, either by directly killing them or causing them to lose their mind and then kill each other. So this group of friends has to very quickly try to unravel the mystery surrounding the murders and uncover the truth of what really happened there, and find a way to ease the vengeful spirits and help them move on before they all end up getting killed by them. Like all the anime on this list, the series is full of violence with a very large number of people being killed, but the thing that makes this one rank really high up on the list is the level of detail put into the gore. It's extremely rare for a more modern anime to put that type of detail into its gore, where people are getting cut apart with intestines spilling out everywhere and having wounds that show things like exposed brain. The deaths are extremely brutal, not holding back and not panning away to avoid showing the most brutal scenes. They don't even hold back showing the violence that was committed upon the elementary school children. So you see the corpses of horribly mutilated children, showing them with their organs exposed or with their head getting cut off. The gore is so extreme that there's scenes where there's intestines and entrails littered throughout the school's hallways. To me, this is only one of 2 anime post-year 2000 with the amount of detail of gore and the amount of brutality in its deaths to come close to the violence seen in anime like Genocyber. And before I get to the number 1 entry, here's a few honorable mentions that were also very violent and were close to making the list but just missed it. Ones I had are gonna be Shiki, Another, Terraform Mars, Gantz, Black Lagoon, Toko, Shadowstar Narutaru, and Baki the Grappler. And finally, at number 1, what is in my opinion the most violent anime to come out after year 2000 is Ichi the Killer Episode 0. This is a 1-episode OVA released in 2002, and it serves as a prequel and a type of origin story to the main character of what's probably one of the most sick and violent manga that I've ever read, Ichi the Killer, which is probably a little bit more famous for its live-action adaptation directed by Takashi Miike, which is also known as one of the most violent movies of all time. I really struggled with deciding where to rank this anime in this list because it's not an anime that has the most amount of blood or even the most amount of deaths or even the most detailed gore, but there's something about the violence in this OVA that just felt a bit different than the violence in many of the other anime on this list, in a way that it just felt a little bit more sick and twisted and more gratuitous than some of the violence in some of the other anime on this list. Ichi is a guy where I'm not sure if he's supposed to be mentally handicapped or something, but he seems very slow and naive and easily manipulated, and thus he's bullied horribly at school. This OVA introduces an original story that serves to be a somewhat origin story for Ichi, showing how he becomes the invincible assassin that he is in the main story. In short, the story is basically about him discovering that he's excited by basically committing violence and then eventually killing people. After discovering this, he constantly fantasizes about it and can't stop thinking about committing violence. First, he starts out by killing the pet rabbits at his school, and then eventually ends up murdering his entire family with a baseball bat. Ichi is extremely strong and basically unstoppable when he loses it, and ends up completely brutalizing and mutilating the person that he's attacking. The OVA shows him getting discovered by the guy that uses him and turns him into Ichi the Killer, by basically training him in karate and attaching blades to his shoes, and then telling him that the people that he wants him to kill are bullies. So Ichi loses it and then completely slaughters anyone that this guy tells him to kill. This OVA doesn't really show too much of him once he becomes Ichi the Killer, mostly focusing on his younger life. Despite the short runtime, they managed to fit in a whole lot of violence and gore, making sure to highlight the brutality of the violence and not holding back on any of the details of the gore. Basically everyone in this OVA and also in the original manga are all pretty horrible people that are extremely violent and cruel, and all seem eager to commit horrible acts upon each other. The violence in this OVA probably stands out to me as the most violent anime post year 2000, probably because of the twisted aspect to it, and it takes a more almost sexualized aspect to it, where Ichi gets extremely excited by committing these violent acts. Like in one scene where he's getting harassed by two guys, and then he ends up losing it on them and attacking them, and he ends up bashing one's head in so bad that the guy's brain's exposed, and then Ichi just right there ends up whipping out his dick. The whole OVA is filled with scenes like that, which kind of puts the violence up to a whole new level that I've never really seen in any other anime, because the violence is just way more twisted in this way, rather than other violent anime where a lot of the violence just comes from battle scenes or violence that's more depicted as part of an action scene. The amount of violence packed into such a short OVA, and considering how twisted and disgusting it is, makes Ichi the Killer Episode 0, in my opinion, the most violent anime to come out after year 2000. And that's going to do it for my list. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like the video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. And thank you so much for watching.